Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we followed the Swedish army on a bit of an emotional roller coaster ride in 1632. The year began well enough, with the army setting off towards Vienna in March, after a pleasant winter of plenty on the river Rhine. They continued to plunder their way through Bavaria, when they even managed to kill the imperial commander Tilly. But that meant the emperor brought back the old brooder Wallenstein, who, even though he was a bit of a sociopath, knew how to conduct a war like no one else. To eliminate the threat posed by Wallenstein, Gustavus Adolphus turned away from the road to Vienna and instead marched north. After a summer where the Swedes failed to save Nuremberg and only just managed to escape themselves, they met the imperial army on yet another muddy battlefield outside Leipzig in Saxony in early November 1632. The battle was fought in heavy fog, which meant that the fighting itself was confusing. In the end, the Swedes won. Sort of. Perhaps mostly because Wallenstein thought he was defeated, so the Swedish victory was a little dodgy. But worse still, Gustavus Adolphus had been killed. Now the Swedish army was leaderless, not to mention Sweden. Today, we'll see how the Swedes try to figure out what to do next. Episode 90, The Show Must Go On. The death of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion from the North, at the relatively young age of 37, was obviously a game changer. The emperor and his allies rejoiced at the news that this formidable foe had been felled, and in Sweden, the death of the king was greeted with shock. But the emperor didn't currently have the resources to capitalize on the fact that his opponents were now leaderless, and the Swedes were still reeling from the sudden death of the king. That meant that 1633 was a year of relative peace, or at least little fighting. Neither side had the ability to go on. At least not for now. But they were doing what they could to gather strength for the continued war. There was no denying that everything changed with the death of the King of Sweden at Lutzen. Who would take his place, both on the throne and as the leader of the Protestant coalition in Germany? He only had one child, a 6-year-old girl, Christina. In order to avoid any unwanted intervention from the Polish branch of the Vasa dynasty, everyone in Sweden quickly closed ranks behind the little girl and recognized her as their new monarch. But she was still only a 6-year-old girl, so a regency government was set up. The leader of the regency was Axel Oxenstierna, the king's trusted chancellor, whom I've mentioned briefly before. When the king died, Oxenstierna was 49 years old. He was the perfect man to pick up the reins, a clever diplomat with an extraordinary memory and a knack for administration who had the ability to work almost non-stop. Even though he was a haughty man, proud of his aristocratic status, he always put the interests of the crown before his own, or his peers. He had always been the only man who dared to criticize Gustavus Adolphus to his face, and he had been able to guide the hot-headed and impulsive king, turning his grand ideas and visions into actual political reality. His French counterpart, the Cardinal Mazarin, is supposed to have quipped that if all Europe's ministers were on one ship, the rudder should be handed over to Axel Oxenstierna. So the Swedes were incredibly lucky that this incredibly competent man had happened to be around, and in the position to take over the government at this point of crisis. Because it was a crisis. It's true that the Swedes were in a good military position after the Battle of Lutzen, but the political situation was a completely different story. Gustavus Adolphus had been the driving force behind the Swedish intervention in the war between Protestants and Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire, and he had also been the unifying force among German Protestants. Now that he was gone, Swedes in high places started to talk about peace. Already when the war had been going well, one aristocrat had pointed out to Axel Oxenstierna that we've conquered land from others but ruined our own in the process. And now the prospects of war were far bleaker. Also, German Protestant leaders were starting to look around for a way out of this increasingly unpleasant situation they found themselves in. The appetite for continued war was in a general decline. Not only the regular people most affected by the war wanted an end to the fighting, also many German Protestant leaders felt it was high time to shut this conflict down before any more damage was done. There were still a few religious fanatics who insisted on a war to final victory, but they seemed to grow fewer by the minute. Even though Axel Oxenstierna wasn't a religious fanatic or a man who enjoyed fighting in the way that Gustavus Adolphus had, the chancellor knew that Sweden simply couldn't afford peace right now. Ending the war at this stage would have been disastrous for the Swedish crown, unless the Germans would be willing to pay all of Sweden's war debts, all the soldiers' unpaid salaries, and give Sweden North German lands as compensation for all their trouble. And that wasn't going to happen. No one in the Holy Roman Empire would agree to it, and Sweden wasn't in a position to demand it. So the war went on, at least partly because the Swedes couldn't afford to end it. In early 1633, Oxenstierna gathered Sweden's German allies in a town called Heilbronn, north of Stuttgart. There, he managed to get the Protestant princes to agree to keep the war going, which was no mean feat, considering that so many of them had preferred to sue for peace. But as impressive as the diplomatic achievement was, Oxenstierna wasn't able to make Sweden's increasingly unwilling allies pay for the continued war. So he was still in a bit of a bind. In 1633, the Swedish army wasn't in a position to capture new land, which would have enabled them to demand contributions that would have paid for the war. Oxenstierna did manage to apply enough pressure to make Sweden's allies fork over some money, but it was done begrudgingly and was delivered so late that the army wasn't ready to start fighting until August 1633, and by then it was too late in the campaign season to get anything meaningful done. If 1633 had been an ominous year, 1634 would turn out to be disastrous. The gathering storm clouds would start to unload their metaphorical rain on the Swedes. But it began well enough with offensives. The Saxon army forced its way into Habsburg territory and reached all the way back to Prague, even though they couldn't retake the city this time around. The Swedes also made an incursion back into familiar territory when they raided deep into Bavaria again. But once again, the Swedes had to change their plans because of an imperial siege of an allied city, this time Nördlingen, some 130 kilometers northwest of Munich. The Duke of Weimar and the Swedish Field Marshal Gustav Horn went there to relieve the city. They went there together, but not with a unified command, because both men were proud and harbored a mutual dislike and distrust of one another. That's never a good start, and it didn't really go better from then on. On August 27th, they attacked the Imperial Army. The battle was an unmitigated disaster, and the Swedish forces were routed with heavy losses. Horn's army suffered 6,000 casualties in dead, wounded, and captured. The field marshal himself was in the latter category. He'd spent the next 8 years in imperial captivity. The imperial forces also captured 130 standards, some 70 cannons, and 4,000 wagons from the baggage train. After the battle, imperial soldiers feasted for 5 days on meat, bread, and wine they'd looted from the defeated Swedes. The imperial triumph at Nördlingen in 1634 was bad news for a lot of people, not least for the local Protestants who were now exposed to the wrath of the Catholic forces. But it was a catastrophe for Sweden. The Swedish intervention in the war had never been popular among German princes, but they had tolerated it and even allied with the Swedes as long as the invaders had been victorious. But now, when they'd lost, they were abandoned. In May 1635, the Elector of Saxony, the pacifist drunkard, signed a peace deal with the Emperor. According to the deal, Saxony and all other German states that joined the agreement would put their forces under imperial command and assist in recapturing all lands lost by the Emperor since 1630, that is, when the Swedes invaded. In the summer months following the finalizing of the agreement, almost all German princes and free cities that had been Swedish allies signed the deal, joining the Emperor's camp. In this situation, Axel Oxenstierna and the Swedish leadership had no choice but to evacuate Swedish bases in the southern parts of the Holy Roman Empire. They relocated north to reconsolidate their positions and try to save what could be saved. The retreat meant that the ability to have the war pay for itself decreased even further when the land they controlled and therefore could force to pay contributions became smaller. So the Swedes back home were back to paying for the war. That was obviously not good news. To make matters worse, a new war with Poland-Lithuania was looming on the horizon. The last war hadn't actually ended with a peace agreement, only ended with a ceasefire, and it expired in 1635. Since the Poles had recently ended another war against Russia and the Ottomans, there was a risk they'd now turn their attention back to the Swedes, ready to exploit its precarious situation. To avoid yet another ruinous war, Sweden had no other choice than to give up the Prussian ports that they'd captured from Poland, handing them back to the Poles. That avoided war, but at the same time it robbed the Swedish crown of a very lucrative source of income, further exacerbating the financial problems. A pressing part of those problems was that the army leadership was finding it increasingly difficult to pay the troops. This once again highlighted the danger of relying on mercenaries. These were soldiers who were fighting for money, not for king and country. If you didn't pay them, they wouldn't fight. At least not for you. At the same time as the Swedish leadership was struggling to find money to pay their hired swords, a proclamation from the emperor was circulating among soldiers in Swedish service. It promised amnesty and good wages to all soldiers who had fought in the Swedish army but who were willing to switch sides and fight for the emperor instead. That increasingly tempting carrot was also paired with a stick. Any soldier who insisted on staying and fighting for the Swedes should not expect any mercy. Their punishment would be death. We know that this kind of propaganda was met with a certain amount of interest among the armed forces, not least since Axel Oxenstierna once had to be smuggled out of a military encampment at night and whisked away by loyal troops to avoid being taken prisoner by mercenaries who had decided to accept the emperor's offer. But Axel Oxenstierna wasn't only a skillful diplomat and politician, he was also lucky, because he wasn't the only one who was worried about what would happen if Sweden withdrew from the war. Like all French leaders, Cardinal Richelieu feared growing Habsburg power, and once again saw the threat of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire surrounding France, threatening her interests on all sides. So in May 1635, a herald showed up on the Grand Place, the main square in Brussels, then a part of the Spanish Netherlands, controlled by the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty. The herald stood in front of the magnificent city hall and announced that King Louis XIII of France had declared war on King Philip IV of Spain. This was music to Oxenstierna's ears. Now France was in the war for real, not just supplying funds that could be withdrawn at any time. France was the best ally imaginable. The French crown had way more money and resources than any other party involved in this conflict. With all these French resources, the Holy Roman Empire wouldn't stand a chance to win a protracted war, since the emperor would run out of money long before the French king did. So who cared that the French were Catholics? No one. In fact, the French declaration of war can be seen as something of a watershed moment in the 30 Years' War. It was becoming less of a war of religions and more a classic geopolitical war for every passing day. From now on, and until peace finally returned, there would be Catholics and Protestants on both sides of the conflict, since the emperor had made peace with most Protestant princes, and France and Sweden were on the same side. It was now a war of control over the European mainland, more than religion. But even though they had all the money and all those resources, the beginning of the war wasn't good for the French. Unlike the imperial army, they had yet to modernize their armed forces along the lines of the Swedish way of fighting. So the first French offensive was actually not only stopped by the Spanish, but in July 1636, Spain even invaded France from the north. At the same time, an army of imperial and Saxon troops invaded Brandenburg, attacking the Swedes. The pacifist Elector John George of Saxony had now put his army at the disposal of the imperial war effort and was leading it in an attempt to drive the Swedes, his former allies, out of the Holy Roman Empire. Against a unified imperial and Saxon front, the Swedes were outnumbered and should have retreated according to textbook behavior. But the Swedish army command decided that yet another retreat, even if it was sound military tactics, would be bad optics. It would threaten to undermine the morale of the troops further, and it would endanger the shrinking Swedish bridgehead along the Baltic Sea coast. So they decided to stand and fight. The Swedish army was now commanded by John Banér. Both he and the imperial commander, Gallas, were alcoholics. But it's said that Banner could handle his job even when he was drunk, whereas Gallas couldn't do it even when he was sober. The two armies circled around each other for 11 days in northern Brandenburg, until the Swedes caught up with the imperial troops on September 24th, close to a small town called Wittstock. What followed was a long and confused battle, like battles tended to be in the 17th century. Banner took a huge risk by sending his whole left flank on a mission to trap the imperial army by outflanking them. But to manage this, the Swedish soldiers had to make their way through a forest, which was slow going. In the meantime, the imperial army got the upper hand, and by the time the Swedes came out on the other side of the forest, they arrived just in time to stop a collapse of the Swedish lines. If they had moved just a little slower, the battle at Wittstock would have been yet another disaster for the Swedish army. But in order for it to have been a triumph, they would have had to move a little faster. As it turned out, they couldn't capitalize properly on their sudden appearance out of nowhere, because it was too late in the day and the sun was already setting. Both armies set up camp on the battlefield, only a few hundred meters from each other. The Swedes were preparing to resume the fighting in the morning, but Banner's risky maneuver must have spooked the imperial commanders, because when dawn broke on September 25th, the Swedes woke up realizing the imperial army had retreated, leaving all their artillery behind in their hurry to get away from the battlefield. The Swedish cavalry jumped on their horses and chased after the retreating imperial soldiers, and the retreat turned into a rout. The imperial army suffered heavy casualties and was dispersed under the onslaught. The Swedes captured 151 regimental flags, the elector's golden carriage, and his silverware, which he, for some reason, had felt he needed to bring with him when he went to war. The loss at Wittstock frightened the emperor, and he ordered the army that had invaded France to return to strengthen the domestic front, thus relieving the French. Paris was saved. Also in Sweden, the joy and relief was palpable. Finally some good news from the war again. The Swedish reputation had been rehabilitated after the disaster at Nördlingen. In gratitude, the commanders John Banner and Lennart Torstensson were granted lands by the crown, both in Sweden and in Germany. But apart from saving Paris and making the Swedish commanders rich, the victory didn't do much to change the tide of the war. The slow Swedish retreat northward continued. The following year, 1637, the emperor had an army of some 47,000 soldiers, whereas the Swedes only had around 14,000. Things did not look good. In the spring of 1637, the Swedes found themselves in full retreat northward, with the imperial army in hot pursuit, trying to cut them off from their base areas along the coast. For a long time, the Swedes seemed to be able to make it back to safety in Pomerania, where reinforcements could help them hold off the imperial onslaught. Thanks to their flexibility and speed, and the ability of their commanders, the Swedes managed to slip away from the imperial troops time after time. But on June 27th, John Banner and his army seemed to be trapped. They suddenly realized that their way north was cut off by Gallas and an array of former Swedish allies who had turned against them and joined the emperor. In a desperate move, Banner sent his wife and the wives of all the other senior officers, together with the most valuable parts of the baggage train, to the east instead of the north. They stood only some 40 kilometers away from the Polish border, and Banner hoped this group of mostly aristocratic Swedish women would be able to slip across and to buy safe conduct for the rest of the Swedish army, which would then be able to escape the imperial trap. 3 days later, on June 30th, the bulk of the Swedish army was supposed to follow. But then Banner suddenly gave new orders. Instead of going east, he ordered the troops west. It turned out that the Polish plan had been a bluff all along. Banner had hoped to fool Gallas and his army to chase off in the wrong direction. And it worked. Now the Swedish army moved as quickly as they possibly could in the opposite direction, and after a 4-day march, where they must have kept looking over their shoulders constantly, they finally reached reinforcements at Eberwalde, and the Swedish army was saved. Banner's trick was hailed as a great tactical triumph in Sweden and abroad. And it was a triumph, for sure, but you don't win wars by retreating successfully, and the basic threat remained. And it didn't exactly help that the Swedish army was in horrible condition. By now, only 11,000 men remained. Most of them wore torn clothes, little more than rags, and many were even barefoot. Worse still, there was next to no money to pay them. The only land still in Swedish hands, the Duchy of Pomerania, had been so thoroughly bled dry during the war that it could hardly support its quickly dwindling population, not to mention the Swedish army. Wherever you went, you were met by abandoned farms and villages. Only 30 to 40% of the pre-war population remained. Almost everything was destroyed, even the mills, which meant that the few remaining peasants were reduced to grinding their flour between tombstones. In a letter to Oxenstierna, Baner described the sorry state of affairs, saying, "There is only sand and air left." So at the beginning of 1638, 8 years after the invasion, the Swedes were back where they had started. They basically stood with their backs to the Baltic Sea along a thin sliver of land from Stralsund to Kolberg, and Gallas, who had eventually realized that he'd been tricked, showed no signs of slowing down his advance. That winter, a cold and miserable winter, the imperial troops had pressed on, and they even managed to reach the Baltic Sea in a few places. For instance, the strategically vital island of Usedom, where Gustavus Adolphus and his invasion army had first set foot on German soil, was one of the places that were captured. The Swedish commander, John Baner, feared that Gallas wouldn't have to push particularly hard for the Swedish position to unravel completely. To try and stave off the final collapse of their gains on the continent, the Swedes met with a French delegation in the North German city of Hamburg. There, Paris agreed to pay the Swedes 1 million livres per year during 3 years to make sure that the war would continue and the Habsburgs wouldn't be able to threaten France for the foreseeable future. But even though they now could expect another injection of French cash, the Swedes still felt enough pressure to agree to start peace negotiations. Or rather, they agreed to start negotiations about how to negotiate. In a separate meeting, French and Swedish delegates met with representatives from the Emperor as well as England and Denmark to try and figure out a way to end the war. But they didn't get far, not least because most of the time was wasted on quarrels about protocols and international etiquette. They would argue endlessly over issues of precedence and hierarchy. For instance, should carriages carrying the ambassador from an elector or duke be allowed to drive in front of an empty carriage belonging to the ambassador of a king? Another hot issue was who would arrive first to a meeting and who would greet whom first. We may roll our eyes in exasperation over the way they wasted precious time over such inconsequential questions, but the thing is that it wasn't inconsequential at all. Deciding these things was the same as deciding who was top dog in the room. And representing the most prestigious country was an enormous advantage in the negotiations, something that could very well result in a final deal that would be more favorable to you. For the same reason, the Swedish government spent huge sums dolling up their delegation to these negotiations. Sweden wanted to be perceived as a major European power, something it most definitely wasn't. It wasn't even the strongest northern European power, that was still Denmark. The Swedes had just had a few lucky years of fighting on the continent, but it was crucial for the Swedes to make all the others believe that their military success had been grounded in real military and economic muscle. A fake-it-till-you-make-it kind of situation. In the end, the only concrete results of the negotiations in Hamburg was that all the parties agreed to start peace negotiations. At some other time, in some other location. The question was where. Preferably, it should be somewhere neutral. But who was truly neutral in this conflict? At first, the emperor had suggested that the Pope could host the peace negotiations in Rome. That didn't go down particularly well in the Swedish camp, obviously. They not only shut down the idea, but also made it clear to the emperor that they would need not one, but 2 locations in order to avoid unnecessary conflicts about ranks and status between the 2 allies, the Swedes and the French. The emperor then suggested Constance and Trier. They're both lovely towns, but the problem is that they're over 400 kilometers apart, so going back and forth while conducting negotiations wouldn't be very practical. The French suggested Cologne and Hamburg, but they're equally far from each other. The Swedish suggestion was Münster and Osnabrück, two towns close to the Dutch border. They were merely some 50 kilometers apart, which made traveling between the two negotiations much more doable. In the end, the Swedish suggestion was accepted, and it's because Münster and Osnabrück are both located in Westphalia that the peace that would eventually end the 30 Years' War is called the Peace of Westphalia. But we're not there quite yet. Next time, the war will go on, as the Swedes hope that the next influx of French money will come in time to save them from complete annihilation by Galler's troops in Pomerania. Next time will not, however, be in 2 weeks as usual. This year I'm going to do the European thing and take the month of August off. But if you're anxious to find out what happened next, don't worry. I'll return to regular programming at the beginning of September, when the Scandinavian summer definitely will be over, the migrating birds will be gathering for their trek to Africa, and the days will be getting shorter. But now it's still summer, so let's all enjoy a few glorious weeks full of enough sunshine, poolside cocktails, bicycle excursions, berry picking and alfresco dining to help us through the long, dark and cold months that the Scandinavian winter has in store for us. But before I sign off today, though, I have one last quick item of housekeeping to take care of. I want to answer another question I've received from a listener. This one also deals with nomenclature, and more specifically why I keep referring to Poland instead of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or at least Poland-Lithuania. After all, the political union of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had been a thing since the late 1560s, and it would be around for another 30 years or so. The short answer is that I am lazy, and I've been using the name Poland as shorthand. I have no defense, and I promise I'll do better. In fact, I've already started, and so in this episode I refer to Poland-Lithuania when I was talking about the political entity, even though I kept saying only Poland when referring to geography. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer Twitter, or X as it's called these days, then you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.